For nearly 500 years, the Kurdish people have lived divided, not by their own choice, but by the borders of empires that were never theirs to begin with. In 1514, the Ottoman and Safavid empires clashed at the Battle of Chaldiran, turning the Kurdish homeland into a contested frontier between two rival powers. By 1639, the Treaty of Zuhab formally cut that homeland in two, splitting Kurdish territory between the Ottomans and the Persians in an agreement the Kurds themselves had no part in negotiating. That division, redrawn again after the First World War and again through the 20th century, has held for close to 5 centuries, leaving the Kurds the largest ethnic group in the world, without their own internationally recognized state. But 500 years of political division raised a deeper question no empire, treaty, or modern government could ever fully answer. If outside powers could redraw the map again and again, was Kurdish identity itself equally recent, a modern invention layered on top of whatever people happen to live in these mountains? Or did it run deeper than any border ever drawn across it? That deeper question is exactly what historians, linguists, and geneticists have spent more than a century trying to answer. Historians argued. Linguists disagreed with archaeologists. 20th century political movements built entire national narratives around one version of the story, while rival scholars insisted the evidence pointed somewhere else entirely. For a nation of more than 30 million people, the question of where their ancestors actually came from was never just academic. It was tied directly to identity, to territorial claims, and to a homeland that stretches across the mountains where modern Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria now meet. The stakes of this debate went far beyond scholarly curiosity. Throughout the 20th century, competing governments in the region had their own political reasons to prefer one origin story over another. A narrative of recent migration could be used to frame Kurdish claims to the land as more contested, while a narrative of ancient continuous habitation could be used to support arguments for Kurdish self-determination and recognition. For a stateless population whose identity has been shaped as much by displacement and division as by shared culture, the scientific answer to where did we actually come from carried weight that most ethnic origin questions never have to bear. Then, geneticists opened up the genome, and what they found didn't just answer the question. It quietly overturned the version of Kurdish origins that had been repeated as fact for over a century, replacing a story of recent migration with something far older, far more rooted, and in one particular finding, far more surprising than almost anyone studying Kurdish history expected. This is the story of how DNA reshaped our understanding of the Kurdish people, one of the most ancient populations in the Middle East, currently living without a state of their own. In 2005, a team of researchers led by Ivan Nasidze at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, published the first comprehensive genetic study focused specifically on Kurdish populations, analyzing mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome markers across 3 distinct Kurdish-speaking groups: Zazaki and Kurmanji speakers from Turkey, and a separate Kurmanji-speaking community that had migrated generations earlier to Georgia in the Caucasus. The study compared this data against genetic samples from European, Caucasian, and Central Asian populations, aiming to settle a question that linguists and historians had debated for well over 100 years without ever reaching consensus. That study became one of several major genetic investigations into Kurdish origins over the following 2 decades. Researchers including Antonio Arnaiz-Vilena and colleagues conducted HLA immune system gene studies across Kurdish communities in Iraq, Iran, and Georgia, comparing what are known as human leukocyte antigen markers, genes that tend to be highly conserved across many generations and are frequently used by population geneticists to trace deep ancestral substrates rather than recent mixing. Later research teams turned to more granular Y chromosome short tandem repeat analysis conducted directly among Sorani Kurdish communities in Sulaymaniyah province, Iraqi Kurdistan, sampling more than 160 individuals to build a detailed picture of paternal lineage diversity within the population. Together, these studies, spanning nearly 2 decades and multiple independent research teams working with different genetic markers and different Kurdish subpopulations, would eventually assemble a genetic picture detailed enough to test every major theory about Kurdish origins that had ever been proposed. And the results did not favor the theory most people, including many Kurds themselves, had grown up believing. To understand why that mattered so much, you have to understand the theory the genetic evidence was up against. The traditional, most widely repeated account of Kurdish origins traces the Kurdish people back to the ancient Medes, an Iranian-speaking people who built a powerful empire across the Zagros Mountains and the Iranian plateau, roughly 2,600 years ago, eventually helping to overthrow the Assyrian Empire before being absorbed into the larger Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. In this telling, the ancestors of today's Kurds were part of a broader wave of Indo-European-speaking tribes who migrated into the region from Central Asia and the Eurasian steppe roughly 4,000 years ago, eventually settling permanently into the mountainous terrain that Kurds still inhabit today. This theory fit naturally with the fact that the Kurdish language belongs to the Iranian branch of the Indo-European language family, closely related to Persian, and it became the foundational narrative behind 20th century Kurdish nationalist movements, which pointed to the ancient Medes as proof of a continuous, distinct Kurdish civilization stretching back nearly 3,000 years, a civilization, advocates argued, at least as old and legitimate as the neighboring nations that eventually absorbed Kurdish territory into their own borders. But this was never the only theory on the table. A rival account, championed by researchers including Antonio Arnaiz Villena and colleagues studying the immune system genetics of Middle Eastern populations, proposed something almost the opposite: that the Kurds were not primarily descended from Indo-European migrants at all, but from a much older indigenous population that had lived in the mountainous Fertile Crescent region since long before any Indo-European speakers arrived. This theory pointed toward the Hurrians, a non-Indo-European Caucasian language-speaking people who built kingdoms in the same mountainous region as early as 4,000 years ago, and whose descendants are thought to have gone on to found the Urartian kingdom centered around Lake Van, and who some historians and linguists believe represent the deepest layer of Kurdish ancestry. A population so ancient that some researchers describe the Kurds as essentially autochthonous, meaning native to the land itself rather than descended from any outside migration, with roots potentially stretching back as far as 8,000 years to the earliest agricultural settlements of the Fertile Crescent, among the very first places on Earth where humans domesticated crops and animals. A third position split the difference, proposing that Kurdish origins involved multiple distinct ancestral layers arriving at different times, ancient indigenous mountain populations blending over thousands of years, with successive waves of Iranian-speaking migrants, Assyrian and Mesopotamian influences, and later Turkic and Arab contact following the region's numerous conquests. The territory at the center of this debate, often referred to as Kurdistan, even though it corresponds to no single recognized country, spans a rugged mountain and highland region roughly the size of France, straddling the modern borders of Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Syria, and small parts of Armenia. Following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War, promises of Kurdish statehood outlined in early peace negotiations were ultimately abandoned, and the Kurdish homeland was instead divided among the newly drawn borders of the modern Middle East, a political outcome that, over the following century, made the question of ancient Kurdish origins inseparable from ongoing debates about self-determination, minority rights, and territorial legitimacy in every country where Kurdish populations live today. Historical records only added to the tangle rather than resolving it. Sumerian cuneiform tablets dating back roughly 5,000 years already referenced a land of Karda in the same mountainous region. Assyrian records from around 3,000 years ago used a name, Kurti, to describe mountain peoples living in the same territory at a time when the Assyrian Empire was expanding aggressively into the surrounding highlands and documenting the various peoples it encountered or conquered. Later, Greek and Roman writers described mountain tribes in the same region under yet other names, and medieval Islamic geographers writing over 1,000 years ago used terminology that modern historians debate the precise meaning of, sometimes applying it broadly to any mountain-dwelling nomadic group in the region, rather than to a single, clearly defined ethnic population. Whether these ancient references describe the direct ancestors of modern Kurds, an unrelated population that happened to live in the same location generations or centuries apart, or some complicated mixture of both, was a question no historical document alone could ever answer. Names recorded by outside empires often described geography and lifestyle as much as they described a single continuous people, and the gap of centuries or millennia between many of these historical references meant that written history alone simply lacked the resolution to trace an unbroken genetic line. For over a century, this debate played out almost entirely through linguistics, historical records, and political argument, with genuinely irreconcilable positions on both sides. Linguists could trace the Kurdish language's Indo-European roots with confidence, tying it closely to Persian and other Iranian languages through shared vocabulary, grammar, and sound patterns built up over millennia. But language and genetic ancestry are not the same thing. Populations can, and frequently do, adopt new languages through cultural contact, trade, or conquest without those languages reflecting the majority of their genetic ancestry. A pattern documented repeatedly across human history, from the British Isles to Ethiopia. Only genome-level analysis, comparing actual biological inheritance rather than linguistic classification, could determine whether the median migration theory, the indigenous Hurrian theory, or some blend of the two actually matched the DNA evidence. The genetic evidence, once researchers finally assembled it, told a story that surprised advocates of the simple median migration theory. The 2005 Max Planck Institute study found that Kurdish groups across all three populations sampled showed their closest genetic relationships not to Central Asian populations, the region the traditional migration theory would predict as a source, but to other West Asian populations, meaning groups already established in and around the Middle East and Anatolia. Kurdish genetic data was, in the researchers' own comparative analysis, most distant from Central Asian groups of any region tested. If the ancestors of the Kurds truly represented a relatively recent wave of migrants arriving 4,000 years ago from Central Asia and the Eurasian steppe, their genetic signature should have shown a much closer relationship to Central Asian populations today. It didn't. The researchers also specifically tested and rejected a competing hypothesis that the Zazaki-speaking Kurdish group might have originated separately in northern Iran, distinct from other Kurdish populations. Genetically, Zazaki speakers proved highly similar to other Kurdish groups, despite linguistic differences significant enough that Zazaki and Kurmanji are sometimes classified as separate languages rather than dialects of the same tongue. The study did uncover a genuinely unexpected wrinkle, though. On mitochondrial DNA passed down through the maternal line, Kurdish groups showed a closer relationship to European populations than to neighboring Caucasian populations, while on the Y chromosome passed down through the paternal line, the pattern reversed, with Kurdish groups showing closer affinity to Caucasian populations instead. This split between maternal and paternal genetic histories suggested a more complicated sex-differentiated history of contact and mixing over thousands of years, rather than a single clean migration event moving as one unified population. The Georgian Kurdish community, whose ancestors migrated to the Caucasus at a documented, more recent point in history, showed clear evidence of a genetic bottleneck from that migration, and notably had not significantly admixed with their Georgian neighbors even after generations of living alongside them, a sign of a population that maintained strong internal cohesion and cultural continuity despite geographic displacement, mirroring a pattern of endogamy seen in many diaspora and minority populations around the world. Perhaps the most direct challenge to the traditional migration narrative came from a separate line of research entirely: studies of the human leukocyte antigen system, a set of genes involved in immune function that geneticists frequently use to trace deep population history because these genes tend to be highly conserved and regionally distinctive over long time scales, changing far more slowly than markers affected by recent, smaller-scale mixing. Research teams studying Kurdish populations in Iraq, Iran, and Georgia using HLA genetic markers concluded that Kurds most likely belonged to an ancient Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, and Caucasian genetic substratum, not a genetic profile consistent with a relatively recent arrival from the Central Asian steppe. These researchers explicitly connected this ancient genetic layer to the Hurrians, the non-Indo-European civilization that had occupied the same mountainous territory millennia before any confirmed Indo-European presence in the region, and to the closely related Eurasian civilization that rose in the same highlands centuries later. One study built directly on this line of evidence carried a title that stated its conclusion outright. Researchers examining Anatolian Turkish and Kurdish populations reported finding no genetic trace of the Aryan invasions that traditional migration theory required. The supposed Indo-European steppe migration simply didn't leave the genetic signature it should have if it had involved a large-scale population replacement rather than a smaller-scale movement of people whose language spread more broadly than their genes did. Instead, the same HLA research suggested that Kurds and neighboring Anatolian Turkish populations shared a surprisingly similar ancient genetic substratum, despite speaking entirely unrelated languages today. Turkish belonging to the Turkic language family, arriving in Anatolia only within the last 1,000 years, reinforcing the broader pattern that language history and genetic history in this region had clearly diverged from one another at multiple points. Y chromosome research conducted directly within Iraqi Kurdistan added further, more granular detail, using a different and more modern genetic methodology than the broader regional studies that came before it. Rather than comparing whole populations against each other using older marker sets, this research applied a panel of 17 short tandem repeat markers, the same forensic-grade genetic technology used in modern criminal investigations and paternity testing, directly to a large sample of Sorani Kurdish men in Suleymaniye province, allowing researchers to build a much finer-grained picture of paternal lineage diversity than earlier studies had been able to achieve. A study analyzing the Sorani Kurdish population, sampling more than 160 individuals, generating 157 distinct genetic haplotypes, found that the single most common paternal lineage in the sample, present in roughly 28% of men tested, belonged to a genetic haplogroup known as J2, a lineage strongly associated with the ancient farming populations of the Fertile Crescent and Anatolia, populations that had been established in the region for many thousands of years before any Indo-European migration is thought to have occurred, and closely tied to the spread of early agriculture out of the Fertile Crescent roughly 10,000 years ago, one of the most significant population expansions in early human history. Other major paternal lineages identified in the broader Kurdish gene pool included haplogroups R1b, G, and E, reflecting a genuinely diverse ancestral background built up over an extremely long period of time and multiple historical episodes of contact, rather than a single clean founding migration from one direction. Together, this body of evidence pointed toward a specific, evidence-based resolution to the century-old debate. Rather than being primarily descendants of a relatively recent Indo-European migration from Central Asia 4,000 years ago, the deep ancestral roots of the Kurdish people trace back much further, to ancient populations already established in the mountainous Fertile Crescent region, plausibly connected to the Hurrians and related ancient Near Eastern peoples, with the Kurdish language's Indo-European character representing a linguistic layer absorbed later through cultural and political contact with Iranian-speaking populations like the Medes, rather than evidence of a wholesale replacement of the region's original inhabitants. Language and genetics had simply moved along two different tracks. A pattern geneticists see repeatedly throughout human history, but one that upended a genetic assumption the traditional Median origin story had quietly relied on for generations. That finding did more than settle an academic argument. It reframed the entire premise of Kurdish origins, from a story about arrival to a story about continuity, positioning Kurdish ancestry among the oldest continuously rooted populations anywhere in the Fertile Crescent, predating not just the modern nation-states that now divide their homeland, but predating the very Indo-European migrations that gave them their language. The most striking twist in the entire Kurdish DNA story, however, came from a different angle altogether, one that had nothing to do with Medes, Hurrians, or ancient migration routes, and everything to do with religion. Kurdish Jewish communities have a documented history in the mountains of northern Iraq and Iran, stretching back at least to the medieval period, and by their own oral tradition considerably further, with some communities tracing their presence in the region to the Assyrian and Babylonian exiles of the ancient biblical era, well over 2,000 years ago. Living for centuries as a religious minority embedded within a much larger Muslim Kurdish population, speaking their own dialects of Aramaic rather than Kurdish, Kurdish Jews maintained a distinct religious and linguistic identity right up until the vast majority of the community emigrated to the newly founded state of Israel in the early 1950s, largely emptying northern Iraq of a Jewish presence that had endured for 2 millennia. The genetic question this history raised was straightforward but had never been properly tested. Were Kurdish Jews genetically closer to other global Jewish diaspora populations, reflecting a Jewish ancestry that had arrived in the Kurdish region from elsewhere in the Middle East and remained largely separate from their Muslim neighbors? Or were they genetically close to the Muslim Kurdish population surrounding them, suggesting a shared, more local, ancestral origin beneath the religious divide? In 2 landmark studies published in 2001 and 2007, researcher Almut Nabel and colleagues examined Y chromosome data comparing Kurdish Jews against Muslim Kurdish populations living in the same territory, alongside broader comparisons to other Jewish diaspora communities and Middle Eastern populations more generally. The findings showed a close genetic affiliation between Kurdish Jews and Muslim Kurds on the paternal line, with both groups sharing deep paternal lineages tracing back to the same ancient Fertile Crescent population, more closely connected to each other than either group was to many other populations they might have been expected to resemble based on religion or presumed diaspora history alone. In other words, centuries of religious divergence, one community practicing Judaism, the other Islam, sat on top of what was, genetically, largely the same underlying ancestral population. Kurdish Jewish communities were not simply a Jewish diaspora population that had settled among unrelated Kurdish neighbors. After wandering from the Middle East following the biblical-era exiles, their oral tradition described. In significant part, they appeared to share direct common ancestry with a Muslim Kurdish population surrounding them, consistent with a scenario in which the ancient inhabitants of the region diverged religiously over the centuries, some adopting Judaism, others later adopting Islam, following the region's 7th century conquests. while remaining on a genetic level remarkably connected to the same deep local ancestral pool. It's a finding that echoes, in miniature, the exact same lesson the broader Kurdish origin story teaches, that religious identity, like linguistic identity, can shift dramatically across history, while the underlying genetic continuity of a population in a specific place remains far more stable than anyone tracking culture alone would ever guess. For more than a century, the story of Kurdish origins was told through the lens of migration, a proud but relatively recent arrival of Iranian-speaking tribes descending from the ancient Medes, sweeping into the Zagros Mountains from the Central Asian steppe. Genetics didn't erase that story entirely, but it revealed something the median migration narrative alone could never fully explain. Ancestry rooted so deeply in the mountainous Fertile Crescent that it likely predates the arrival of any Indo-European language by thousands of years, connected to some of the oldest known civilizations of the ancient Near East, carried forward not by outside conquest and replacement, but by extraordinary continuity in one of the most contested regions on Earth. For a people who today live without an internationally recognized state of their own, spread across the borders of 4 different countries, and shaped by generations of displacement, division, and conflict, the genetic evidence offers something historical and political arguments alone never could. Proof that Kurdish roots in this specific stretch of mountainous land are not recent, not borrowed, and not incidental. They are among the oldest continuous human presences in the region, older, in fact, than the very language that carries their name today, older than the Persian Empire that once absorbed the Medes, older than most of the political borders now drawn across their homeland, and quietly connecting communities as seemingly distinct as Kurdish Muslims and Kurdish Jews through a shared ancestral thread that religion alone could never fully separate. There's something worth sitting with in that last point specifically. 2 communities divided for centuries by faith, by language of daily life, and ultimately by the different nations they would each come to call home after the 20th century's upheavals, turned out to share a genetic inheritance running back to the same ancient mountains. A reminder that the categories people use to divide themselves from their neighbors are very often more recent and more fragile than the deeper biological history connecting them. If a debate this politically significant, running for over a century and tangled up in nationalism, displacement, and competing claims to an entire homeland, could be reshaped this dramatically by genome sequencing, it raises a question worth asking about other populations around the world whose origin stories remain similarly contested. How many other settled narratives, tied tightly to identity and nationhood, are still waiting for DNA to test them properly? And how many of those stories might turn out to reveal more shared ancestry between supposed rivals than anyone currently assumes? If you found this as fascinating as we did, subscribe to DNA Origins for more documentaries uncovering the genetic history hidden inside the world's peoples. Next week, we're heading to West Africa to trace what modern genetic studies have revealed about the deep, surprising origins of the Yoruba people, a story that ends somewhere no one expected. That video is already on the channel.